Hi there everyone, this is the first of this kind of video that I'm doing. I'm calling these Read, Explain, Discuss videos or read videos, where I go chapter by chapter through some of the great works of the 19th and early 20th century, predominantly their metaphysical works. And the point here is to slow down and really try and understand the metaphysical systems that these various thinkers presented to us. And I'm going to start with an absolute corker. This is F.H. Bradley's Appearance and Reality. It was published in 1893, and then a second edition, which is what I'm going to be reading, was published in 1897. I have read it once, but this is really a chance for me to go through it slowly and explain it to others. So these sorts of videos are going to have three sections, as might be expected from the title. I'm first of all just going to read out a chapter or a part of a chapter, if the chapter's a long one, and then going to explain the arguments, try and put them in terms that I think are more easily understood. As you'll see, Bradley's writing style is quite florid. In those explanations, I'm going to try and talk about why he's talking about this, perhaps introduce some philosophical background to his arguments, maybe some of the views he's trying to dismantle and why, and try to make sense of the argument. Then the third part will be discussing it critically, talking about bits that I like. I mean, I'm reading this stuff because I like it, but that doesn't mean I'm going to agree with everything that he says. And to do that, I'm going to discuss the work with two other philosophically minded people who have an interest in idealism broadly, and the British Idealists in particular, where we're going to try to take as much of a critical third-party look at this stuff as we can. So that's the format. Read, explain, discuss in that order. And would love if you want to read along with us. The Appearance and Reality is available through the Gutenberg Press, I believe, but you certainly can find it online. It's obviously out of copy right now. Or you might be able to get hold of a copy yourself. I think they are available with print on demand from various places. I'll stick some links in the description for you to follow that up. But otherwise, even if you don't have a copy, I'm going to start these by reading it out, and then go on to discuss it, explain it and discuss it. So hopefully you enjoy that. Let's see how it goes. So I'm going to start by reading the introduction, which is 6 pages long, and go from there. Okay, introduction. The writer on metaphysics has a great deal against him. Engaged on a subject which, more than others, demands peace of spirit, even before he enters in the controversies of his own field, he finds himself involved in a sort of warfare. He's confronted by prejudices hostile to his study, and he is tempted to lean upon these prejudices, within him and around him, which seem contrary to the first. It is on the preconceptions adverse to metaphysics in general that I am going to make some remarks by way of introduction. We may agree, perhaps, to understand by metaphysics an attempt to know reality as against mere appearance, or to study the study of first principles or ultimate truths, or again the effort to comprehend the universe, not simply piecemeal or by fragments, but somehow as a whole. Any such pursuit will encounter a number of objections. It will have to hear that the knowledge which it desires to obtain is impossible altogether, or, if possible in some degree, it is yet practically useless, or that, at all events, we can want nothing beyond the old philosophies. And I will say a few words on these arguments in their order. A. The man who is ready to prove that metaphysical knowledge is wholly impossible has no right here to any answer. He must be referred for conviction to the body of this treatise, and he can hardly refuse to go there, since he himself has, perhaps unknowingly, entered the arena. He is a brother metaphysician with a rival theory of first principles, and this is so plain that I must excuse myself from dwelling on the point. To say the reality is such that knowledge cannot reach it is a claim to no reality. To urge that our knowledge is of a kind which must fail to transcend appearance itself implies that transcendence. For if we had no idea of a beyond, we should assuredly not know how to talk about failure or success. And the test by which we distinguish them must obviously be some acquaintance with the nature of the goal. Nay, the would-be sceptic who presses on us the contradictions of our thoughts himself asserts dogmatically. For these contradictions might be ultimate and absolute truth if the nature of reality were not known to be otherwise. But this introduction is not the place to discuss a class of objections which are themselves, however unwillingly, metaphysical views, and which a little acquaintance with the subject commonly serves to dispel. So far as is necessary, they will be dealt with in their proper place, and I will therefore pass to the second main argument against metaphysics. B. It would be idle to deny that this possesses great force. Metaphysical knowledge, it insists, may be possible theoretically, and even actual, if you please, to a certain degree. But, for all that, it is practically no knowledge worth the name. And this objection may be rested on various grounds. I will state some of these, and will make the answers which appear to me to be sufficient. The first reason for refusing to enter on our field is an appeal to the confusion and barrenness which prevails there. The same problems, we hear it often, the same disputes, the same sheer failure. Why not abandon it and come out? Is there nothing else more worth your labour? To this I shall reply more fully soon, but will at present deny entirely that the problems have not altered. The assertion is about as true and about as false as would be a statement that human nature has not changed. And it seems indefensible when we consider that in history, metaphysics has not only been acted on by the general development, but has also reacted. But, apart from historical questions which are here not in place, I am inclined to take my stand on the admitted possibility. If the object is not impossible, and if the adventure suits us, what then? Others far better than ourselves have wholly failed, so you say. But the man who succeeds is not apparently always the man of most merit, and even in philosophy's cold world, perhaps some fortunes go by favour. One never knows until one tries. But to the question, if seriously I expect to succeed, I must of course answer no. I do not suppose, that is, that satisfactory knowledge is possible. How much we can ascertain about reality will be discussed in this book, but I may say at once that I expect a very partial satisfaction. I am so bold as to believe that we have a knowledge of the absolute, certain and real, though I am sure that our comprehension is miserably incomplete. But I dissent emphatically from the conclusion that, because imperfect, it is worthless. And I must suggest to the objector that he should open his eyes and should consider human nature. Is it possible to abstain from thought about nature? Is it possible to abstain from thought about the universe? I do not mean merely that to everyone the whole body of things must come in the gross, whether consciously or unconsciously in a certain way. I mean that, by various causes, even the average man is compelled to wonder and to reflect. To him the world, and his share in it, is a natural object of thought, and seems likely to remain one. And so, when poetry, art, and religion have ceased wholly to interest, or when they no longer show any tendency to struggle with ultimate problems and to come to an understanding with them, when the sense of mystery and enchantment no longer draws the mind to wander aimlessly and to love it knows not what, when, in short, twilight has no charm, then metaphysics will be worthless. For the question, as things are now, is not whether we are to reflect and ponder on ultimate truth, for perhaps most of us do that and are not likely to cease. The question is merely as to the way in which this should be done. And the claim of metaphysics is surely not unreasonable. Metaphysics takes its stand on this side of human nature, this desire to think about and comprehend reality. And it merely asserts that, if the attempt is to be made, it should be done as thoroughly as our nature permits. There is no claim on its part to supersede other functions of the human mind, but it protests that, if we are to think, we should sometimes try to think properly. And the opponent of metaphysics, it appears to me, is driven to a dilemma. He must either condemn all reflection on the essence of things, and, if so, he breaks, or rather tries to break, with part of the higher side of human nature, or else he allows us to think, but not to think strictly. He permits, that is to say, the exercise of thought so long as it is entangled with other functions of our being. But as soon as it attempts a pure development of its own, guided by the principles of its own distinctive working, he prohibits it forthwith. And this appears to be a paradox, since it seems equivalent to saying, you may satisfy your instinctive longing to reflect so long as you do it in a way which is unsatisfactory. If your character is such that in you thought is satisfied by what does not and cannot pretend to be thought proper, that is quite legitimate. But if you are constituted otherwise, and if in you a more strict thinking is a want of your nature, that is by all means to be crushed out. And, speaking for myself, I must regard this as at once dogmatic and absurd. But the reader, perhaps, may press me with a different objection. Admitting, he may say, that thought about reality is lawful, I still do not understand why, the results being what they are, you should judge it to be desirable. And I will try to answer this frankly. I certainly do not suppose that it would be good for everyone to study metaphysics, and I cannot express any opinion as to the number of persons who should do so. But I think it quite necessary, even on the view that this study can produce no positive results, that it should still be pursued. There is, so far as I can see, no other certain way of protecting ourselves against dogmatic superstition. Our orthodox theology on the one side, and our commonplace materialism on the other side, it is natural to take these as prominent instances, both vanish like ghosts before the daylight of free sceptical inquiry. I do not mean, of course, to condemn wholly either of these beliefs, but I am sure that either, when taken seriously, is the mutilation of our nature. Neither, as experience has amply shown, can now survive in the mind which has thought sincerely on first principles. And it seems desirable that there should be such a refuge for the man who burns to think consistently, and yet is too good to become a slave, either to stupid fanaticism or dishonest sophistry. That is one reason why I think that metaphysics, even if it end in total skepticism, should be studied by a certain number of persons. And there is a further reason which, with myself perhaps, has even more weight. All of us, I presume, more or less, are led beyond the region of ordinary facts. Some in one way, and some in others. We seem to touch and have communion with what is beyond the visible world. In various manners we find something higher, which both supports and humbles, both chastens and transports us. And, with certain persons, the intellectual effort to understand the universe is a principal way of thus experiencing the deity. No one, probably, who has not felt this, however differently he might describe it, has ever cared much for metaphysics. And, wherever it has been felt strongly, it has been its own justification. The man whose nature is such that by one path alone his chief desire will reach consummation, will try to find it on that path, whatever it may be, and whatever the world thinks of it. And, if he does not, he is contemptible. Self-sacrifice is too often the great sacrifice of trade, the giving cheap what is worth nothing. To know what one wants, and to scruple at no means that will get it, may be a harder self-surrender. And this appears to be another reason for some persons pursuing the study of ultimate truth. C. And that is why, lastly, existing philosophies cannot answer the purpose. For whether there is progress or not, at all events there is change, and the changed minds of each generation will require a difference in what has to satisfy their intellect. Hence there seems as much reason for new philosophy as there is for new poetry. In each case, the fresh production is usually much inferior to something already in existence, and yet it answers a purpose if it appeals more personally to the reader. What is really worse may serve better to promote, in certain respects and in a certain generation, the exercise of our best functions. And that is why, so long as we alter, we shall always want, and shall always have, new metaphysics. I will end this introduction with a word of warning. I have been obliged to speak of philosophy as a satisfaction of what may be called the mystical side of our nature, a satisfaction which, by certain persons, cannot be as well procured otherwise. And I may have given the impression that I take the metaphysician to be initiated into something far higher than what the common herd possesses. Such a doctrine would rest on the most deplorable error, the superstition that the mere intellect is the highest side of our nature, and the false idea that in the intellectual world, work done on higher subjects is for that reason higher work. Certainly the life of one man, in comparison with that of another, may be fuller of the divine, or again, may realize it with an intenser consciousness. But there is no calling or pursuit which is a private road to the deity. And assuredly the way through speculation upon ultimate truths, though distinct and legitimate, is not superior to others. There is no sin, however prone to it the philosopher may be, which philosophy can justify so little as spiritual pride. I really love this introduction. I think it strikes an interesting chord of honesty and a realization that metaphysics is a mixture between a rational method that seeks to, in Bradley's words, think properly, but one that is aimed at a certain end, a kind of a felt need to ponder and think and explore ultimate truths or reality as opposed to appearance, or the highest things. But Bradley doesn't think, or says he doesn't, in the introduction, he doesn't think that this is somehow superior to others. He's just trying to justify the pursuit itself. And part of the reason he feels the need to do that in the introduction early on is because metaphysics as a branch of philosophy has been plagued with a kind of self-doubt, a consciousness about what it seeks to do, that there doesn't seem to be any clear rules for pursuing it. And because metaphysicians come to such radically different conclusions about the ultimate nature of reality, it can seed this certain doubt about its worth, its legitimacy, etc. Now, in the wake of the scientific method, this feature of metaphysics, when distinguished from natural science, became very acute. I mean, in scientific contexts, it seems that we have an agreed upon method, a way in which to adjudicate between rival theories or propositions based on how well they account for the empirical data or observed experiment, etc. And especially at the time when Bradley is writing, Newtonian physics seemed effectively insurmountable. Nowadays we have rival physical theories, and there can be difficulties in judging between them. And a realization that science itself goes through its own revolutions where everything we thought might be turned upside down. Bradley's talking in a time where that wasn't the case. And when you go back to, in particular, say, Immanuel Kant, when Kant is writing, he feels the need to justify metaphysics, or to find some way to make metaphysics more scientific or justified. So you read in the preface, I think it might be the introduction, to Kant's Prolegomena, that he speaks of David Hume awaking him from his dogmatic slumber. And he sends out this message saying that until metaphysicians are able to answer this question, which is how is metaphysics as a science possible, then they should just stop doing metaphysics. He points to Thomas Reid's School of Common Sense and says that, he says some very funny things, something along the lines of the fact that appealing to common sense is, as the sort of arbiter of ultimate reality, is just something any old windbag can do. It's something that appeals to our nature, that everyone's opinion is as legitimate as anybody else's, and that common sense somehow is a guide to ultimate truth. And Kant doesn't think that. He instead tries to lay out a method of doing metaphysics that can justify metaphysics as a science, as something that can produce genuine knowledge about the nature of reality, but one that doesn't rely on the principles of science. So it doesn't rely on directly on sense data. So Kant's justification is that he thinks there's a kind of knowledge called synthetic a priori. I don't want to get too far into Kant, but it is helpful background. So the idea is that Kant says that there is some knowledge that genuinely gives us information about the world. So it's not just knowledge to do with the meaning of our words. So, for example, the classic philosophical case is when we say that if I tell you bachelors are married, that isn't synthetic knowledge. That's analytic knowledge. It's if you know what the word bachelor means, you already know that bachelors are unmarried, because it's what bachelor means. You haven't gained any information about the world. All you've done is used the meaning of words to generate other claims which we say are true. So that would be an analytic piece of knowledge. A synthetic piece of knowledge tells you something about the nature of reality, about how things are. It seems like the world could have been different in some sense than it is. It doesn't seem to be a contradiction to assert it. I'm straying into slightly different territory here. So synthetic is telling you something about the nature of the world. Analytics is something to do with the meaning of our words. And then we have this other concept of a priori and a posteriori, which is about the justification for that knowledge. A priori knowledge can be justified just by sitting and thinking about it. It's contradictory for it not to be the case. If it's a posteriori, that's knowledge that's justified by our experience of the world. So Kant thinks that metaphysics is legitimate because it discovers synthetic a priori truths, and it had seemed before that there would be no such thing, that anything that's synthetic, that tells you about the world, could only be discovered by experiencing the world and seeing, well, that's what it is. Grass is green. It's a synthetic truth because it's not based on the meaning of the word grass that it would have to be green. And similarly, it's a posteriori. We don't know whether grass is green without going and having a look. If I were to justify grass being green, I would say, well, look, you can look at it and it's green. But Kant argues that there are kinds of knowledge which he justifies in his work, his Critique of Pure Reason and the Prolegomena, that are synthetic a priori. They're truths that we can know just by thinking about it without going out into the world, that they would be the case. But they are also not just based on the meaning of words. So he gives examples like mathematics. Mathematics is not... The truths of mathematics aren't based just on the meaning of words. It's nothing to do with the meaning of plus and 2, that we know 2 plus 2 equals 4. But similarly, we don't know the truth of that by going out into the world and having a look. So he says there are these kinds of knowledge, and he thinks metaphysics is capable of discovering synthetic a priori truths about the nature of reality. And Kant has a big influence on Bradley and the British Idealists, and his metaphysical claims are to do with things like causation and time and space, etc. So I know that's a bit of a detour, but that's sort of giving you an explanation of why Bradley might feel at the beginning of Appearance and Reality that he has to kind of justify the entire enterprise, justify the place of metaphysics, its importance and its legitimacy, before he embarks on a book about metaphysics. And he considers sort of 3 different objections that a person might make to metaphysics. And the first is just that this kind of knowledge is impossible. And rather than appeal to specific ways in which you might think it's possible, like Kant does, justify how our reason can come up with synthetic a priori truths. Instead, he just sort of flips the argument against the person making this objection, saying that, well, if you tell me that it's impossible to have knowledge about reality, that is itself a metaphysical claim. You're saying reality is of a certain sort that it's impossible to know anything about it, which he says is completely unjustified if you're questioning metaphysics as a whole. This is a metaphysical claim. It's so obvious he doesn't really want to dwell on it. But he's saying that in one ways, one sense, you would, unless you had a metaphysical or some sort of transcendent understanding of reality, you couldn't know that knowledge of it was impossible. And then secondly, he wants to kind of direct them to the rest of his work, saying, well, look, I've written an entire book here presenting metaphysical truths. I'm doing metaphysics. If you can't complain to me up front that what I am producing here in this book, this knowledge of reality, is somehow illegitimate, argue with me. Read the rest of the treatise and argue with me. So that's how he responds to the first one, relatively quick. The second complaint he considers is that metaphysical knowledge is useless. It makes no difference. And so presumably because it's useless, we shouldn't do it. Now, his answer here is, I think, really quite interesting and profound. I mean, he effectively says that, well, humans do ask these questions. We have this burning desire to sort of reach out to ultimate truth and to know how things really, really are out there. I mean, we do it in so many different ways. We do it in religion. We do it in terms of science. We do it in terms of poetry and art. So much of human culture and nature is a grappling for something beyond just appearance, something beyond the stuff that we interact with every day. We think there's something beyond, that there's something more, something higher. And human beings will pursue these questions. We all have our different theories or ways of understanding reality. And what Bradley is saying is that metaphysics says we're pursuing that sort of inner human need in a way that tries to be as rigorous and rational as it can. You know, it's not about relying on sacred texts or scripture or culture or our common sense or what's handed down to us from our ancestors. It's an attempt to start with some certain first principles, think on them long and hard, and sort of build them into a coherent system, a coherent way of viewing the world and reality. So, and he thinks that it's important to do that, even if it's only to try and pull us away from dogmatism or fanatic commitment to certain principles that have been handed to us, or on the other hand, to fall prey to dishonest sophistry. So what he means by that is just people who are good with words, people good at convincing others to believe certain things just because they're eloquent speaker. So metaphysics has a certain way of dealing with these questions that it has its own flavour. It has its own distinct flavour and character. And he's saying, if you're trying to say that method of doing metaphysics, which we all do, is somehow illegitimate, he just thinks that's absurd. Why is it legitimate to think about truth poetically or religiously, but not to do it in a sort of rigorous, disciplined, rational way? So that's his sort of pitch, and he thinks that he's not suggesting that it's a better way or it's something that we should all do, but that at least some people should do this, partly because it's important for some people to do this for some of the reasons I've outlined in terms of helping overcome superstition, etc., but also just because he thinks some people, including himself, are just constituted that way. He has this beautiful passage here where he says, I presume more or less we're all led beyond the region of ordinary facts, some in one way, some in others. We touch or have communion with something beyond. And he thinks that the desire to do metaphysics comes from this same desire to understand the deity, understand the transcendent, the divine, the beyond. Not here speaking in a theistic or religiously bounded way, but just that which is higher. And if you are so constituted, who are you to say I can't pursue things that way? In fact, he thinks that if you are constituted that way, which Bradley says he is, and I feel myself to be as well, he thinks that if you don't pursue it, then you are contemptible, that you are sort of supposedly making some self-sacrifice. But actually, he says it's just giving away cheap something that is worth nothing, that actually that the harder self-surrender to achieve is to acknowledge your own constitutional need or drive for it and to pursue it. So his argument here isn't really a philosophical or rational argument in the strict sense of like a logical argument to a conclusion. But really the complaint isn't a philosophical one either. The complaint is that metaphysics is useless, which is not saying that there's anything wrong with it, just saying that it's useless. Surely you could do something better with your time. And Bradley's response is equally practical or pragmatic. Look, we have these questions, we have these desires and these wants that we need to be satisfied. And in fact, I myself would consider it contemptible not to pursue these questions. And metaphysics says, pursue it in this way, pursue it in terms of rigorous thought from first principles, an attempt to reach beyond how things appear to ask how things really are. And he thinks that is fully legitimate. And then lastly, he addresses the accusation that it's kind of all been done before, that there's nothing new to discover, that metaphysics, any position you could take has been taken before. You go to the philosophers prior to Socrates, called the pre-Socratics. Metaphysics is actually what they did. They were asking questions about the ultimate nature of reality. Some thought it was made of water or flux or change or many different things. But their interest was, what is the deep nature of things, the fundamental nature of reality? And perhaps, Bradley says, perhaps every possible answer to this question has been given. Perhaps every option is already on the table. Anything worth saying in metaphysics has been said before. He's not disagreeing that might be the case. He's also not trying to suggest that he can do it better than anyone before. But what he says is, it's like poetry or art. Every new generation, every transformation or change in human nature or culture or society brings with it the need to re-express, reinterpret, rediscover what that time, that generation, or that people think about ultimate reality, to sort of say it again, to repeat performance, to express again whatever those sort of deepest convictions about the nature of things is, to re-express it to its new generation. He said, maybe I'll be saying it less eloquently. Maybe I'll be doing a much worse job of it, but I'm going to do the job of it to my current circumstance, to the generation in which I live, to the people that I am surrounded by. And I think that that's a very liberating way of thinking about this, because, I don't profess or think that I could possibly be like many of the philosophical greats of the past, but in some sense it's worth saying it again, or reconsidering how you see things again, and re-expressing them in a way that resonates with your own experience, your generation, your culture, your time. And where I gravitated to writers like Bradley was exactly because of this. It just seemed to me that we've reached a certain point in our culture where we need to start to ask these questions again. What is reality really like? How are things ultimately constituted? And how do we think of it? How do we perceive it? How do we make sense of it? And then how does that give our own life, our thinking, our actions, our sense of the aesthetic, some kind of ground? Some kind of something beyond purely taste or an expression of our own inner identity or something, but something that is about connecting with a community, with a society, with a culture, with a time, something bigger than ourselves, the deity, that which is higher, and without the pressure of having to do something fully original, fully new, fully brilliant, that is somehow ultra dazzling, because I'm not capable of that. And I also fully understand and agree with what he says at the very end, which is that despite using words like higher and ultimate or deeper, and something that can absolutely come with the pursuit of philosophy and philosophers in general, which is a kind of a pride at there seems to be two equal and opposite things that I've found philosophers to have. On the one side, there are philosophers who think what they do is solving puzzles and just sort of interesting, that they're interested in it, but it's somewhat pointless. Others that think it's the most important, incredible, noble pursuit you can pursue, that is somehow higher. You can be pulled in either direction, I'll admit. But Bradley thinks that no, it's just one way among many. Amongst people with a certain constitution to ask these questions, and that actually there's nothing about philosophy, philosophical method, metaphysics, or even the way in pursuing these questions that is somehow superior, higher, or better, and that no philosopher can be justified in pride in what they do. I mean, he says spiritual pride, but he means, pride of pursuing the higher things in some supposedly superior way. So, I mean, that's it. I mean, it's an introduction. There aren't so many arguments to go through. But it's more just setting the tone for what Bradley's doing and justifying the book. So anyway, we're going to go from here. We're going to start to look at specific arguments. We're going to start to look at how he conceives of reality and the arguments he makes for it in future videos. But before that, we're going to discuss this introduction. I'm going to discuss it with a couple of my friends and see what you think. Hopefully you get something from it. Thank you.